The Federal Reserve posted its largest ever annual loss in 2023, and they continue to lose money to this day. I think what they're gearing up for is a bank consolidation where banks who are well positioned, who have a lot of reserves, are bearing the fruits of the interest that the Federal Reserve is paying, while banks that are loaded up on commercial debt and treasuries from 2020, 2021, and 2022, when interest rates are low, are really struggling. And I think some point in the future here, we're going to see another banking crisis like we saw last year with Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse. And we could see something that's as severe as 2008 with Lehman Brothers when that collapsed. So we're going to talk about all of that in this video and what it means for the housing market. Before we do, my name is Liam O'Reilly. I'm a realtor in Vermont with Jerry Riley Real Estate. If you have any real estate needs, feel free to reach out to me directly. All of my contact information is in the description. And let's get right into it. So this first article here out of what the Wall Street Journal talks about the deficit that the central bank, that the Federal Reserve ran in 2023. They lost $114.3 billion last year. And you have to remember that the Federal Reserve, they're not a company. They're not something that is in the business of making money. They are put in place to help regulate the economy to, like they say in their meetings, to keep inflation low or to keep inflation at around 2% and unemployment as low as possible, or at a healthy level. Of course, now they're trying to increase unemployment and decrease inflation, but they don't have any reserves. It's not like when they lose this money, they can dip into their bank account and use that to pay these institutions that are holding interest at the Federal Reserve. This is just money that they have to print and give institutions that hold money, that hold deposits at the Fed, right? So the Federal Reserve, they have mortgage-backed securities and they have bonds, and they use the interest from those mortgage-backed securities and from those bonds to pay off banks who keep interest at the Federal Reserve or financial institutions. And they do that through a few methods, but at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're not printing money and giving it to the consumer. They're printing money and they're giving it to these financial institutions who are well positioned, who have reserves at the Federal Reserve, and their other lending facilities that the Fed has set up, and they're paying these institutions interest on the money that's there. So that's money that's not being lent out into the economy, that's not bearing interest because a bank lent it to a business and that business is bringing in revenue and providing something for the people, for the overall economy. This is just money that these banks park at the Federal Reserve and the Fed pays them to keep the money there. So that's what this article is essentially saying, is that the central bank paid more to financial institutions on interest-bearing deposits and securities than it earned from securities that it brought in when interest rates were, that it bought when interest rates were lower. So they loaded up on debt, on mortgage-backed securities, on treasuries when rates were extremely low. So they're not bringing in a whole lot of interest. And now they've hiked rates. They've increased the interest that they're paying these financial institutions who keep their reserves at the Federal Reserve. And because of that, they're losing money, which is essentially just printing money and giving it to these institutions. Now, we can see that reflected in their assets that the St. Louis Fed keeps on their website. So we can see here that back in 2020, during COVID, they spiked. Their assets completely spiked. This is when mortgage rates dropped to 3% or below. The Federal Reserve was buying up mortgage-backed securities. They were buying up U.S. Treasuries, and the size of their balance sheet, their assets, increased drastically. And then it continued to increase until they started their quantitative tightening. And now they've been rolling off their balance sheet. Now, something I wanted to make clear, and I hear people talk about how the Federal Reserve is selling their assets. That's not exactly what they're doing. I mean, sometimes they sell a small amount of their assets, but what they're really doing is they're letting these securities mature. So when the US government pays back their treasury with interest, they're not buying another treasury to replace it. They're just letting it run off, which is naturally reducing the size of their balance sheet. But they're not necessarily selling mortgage-backed securities or selling their treasuries. They're just letting them mature. And we can see that on the New York Fed's website. The New York desk is what conducts the transactions that affect the balance sheet at the Federal Reserve. And we see here that the desk plans to conduct approximately $150 million in small value sale operations noted in the noted monthly period. So from March 14th to April 11th, they sold $150 million worth of their assets, which compared to the $7.5 trillion that they have is extremely low. And they balance it off. So what they've been doing for a while now is they've been selling 1 month and then they'll take a month off right here from February to March. The desk does not have any agency MBS outright operations scheduled this monthly period. And then right here in January, they purchased 150 million in small value operations, and then they took a month off, and then they sold, and then they took a month off, and then they bought. So they're not really just coming out and selling the assets that they have on their balance sheet. They're just letting it roll off naturally, and that is what is decreasing the size of their balance sheet at this point. Regardless of how they're doing it, the story still remains the same, that they're paying more to these financial institutions than they're bringing in, and that number is growing larger and larger the longer that they continue with quantitative tightening, because the smaller the assets are, the smaller their balance sheet gets, the larger the difference is between the interest that the Federal Reserve has to pay out and the money that they're bringing in. As this decreases, as their assets decrease, they bring in less money from interest payments from mortgage-backed securities and from US Treasuries. And while they keep interest rates high, they have to pay out more interest to these banks and to these financial institutions. So what this is doing, what I think it's doing, is it's loading up these larger banks, these banks that are well positioned to, it's essentially stimulating them. It's loading up their balance sheets with more reserves, with more money. And the banks that aren't well positioned, like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank loaded up on US Treasuries that went in 2020, 2021, and 2022 when interest rates were low. And then as the Treasury yields rise, the value of those bonds dropped. And so the value of their assets, the Silicon Valley assets, decreased, which caused the bank to fail. It caused a bank run. And I think we are going to see something similar as commercial loans, as many of these small and medium banks hold a large amount of commercial real estate debt, and those values are dropping, as well as banks that were in a similar situation to Silicon Valley Bank. Those banks that loaded up on treasuries and securities when interest rates are low, the values of those securities have decreased. And so we saw stress earlier this year in New York Community Bank. This has brought medium-sized New York Community Bank to the brink in recent weeks. And so I think what the Federal Reserve is engineering here, as they say they're trying to fight inflation and they're trying to slow down the economy, what they're doing is they are slowing down the economy. They're discouraging banks from lending their money into the overall economy, and they're encouraging them to buy these interest-bearing assets or to hold their money at the Federal Reserve. Now, as we come to the end of QT, we see signs that these financial institutions are keeping a little bit less money at the Federal Reserve, that have a little bit less in reserves. And we see that through the reverse repo facility at the Fed, which has decreased drastically over this past year. So what the reverse repo facility is are banks and institutions that have excess funds, that have excess reserves. They can keep their money at the reverse repo facility. The Fed will lend them some US Treasuries, some government treasuries, and they can earn interest overnight. Again, as opposed to risking that in the market, as opposed to lending that to a business or buying a mortgage-backed security, they can get a risk-free overnight US Treasury investment on the excess reserves that they have. But we've seen this decrease over the past year, and I think that's for two reasons. I think that there's some banks out there that are really struggling with reserves, that don't have excess reserves to deposit into this reverse repo facility that the Fed has set up. And there's other institutions out there that have a good amount of reserves, but are deciding to put it into longer term assets, into longer term debt. So because they see that the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates at some point this year. Now, we don't know exactly when that's going to be. We don't know when this quantitative tightening is going to stop, but I think it's going to happen once these banks that aren't well positioned, like New York Community Bank, like Silicon Valley Bank, start to fail. Once that starts to happen, we're going to see these banks that are better situated start to consolidate the other banks. They're going to buy the assets of the other banks. They're going to take over the banks that fail, like we saw with Silicon Valley and Credit Suisse last year. And so once that starts to happen, and again, I think that's why we've seen the yield curve be inverted for so long. is these banks and these financial institutions, they're preferring to put their money into a longer term treasury, a 10-year US treasury, because they know that at some point in the near future, rates are going to come back down. They're not going to be able to get the return on this US treasury. And as the yield drops on the 10-year treasury, the value of that treasury increases. So these institutions that bought 10-year treasuries now can sell that 10-year treasury for a profit, make a quick buck, or they can hold on and just get that 4.5% interest that they could get today. So how does this affect the overall US economy, and what does this mean for housing? I think that eventually when these banks start to fail, when these smaller banks start to fail and get consolidated by larger banks, again, I don't know for sure that's going to happen, but it seems to be what the Federal Reserve is trying to engineer because of these higher interest rates, because they're printing money, essentially $100 billion last year, and giving it to these large financial institutions. I think once these banks start to fail, the larger banks that are well positioned, they're going to take over those smaller banks. They're going to buy them for a good price, which should help keep the economy going, but it's also going to reduce the amount of lending power that they have. At that point, the Federal Reserve is going to need to start dropping rates, maybe even buying more assets, increasing the size of their balance sheet to encourage lending out there in the economy. Now, how far will rates drop and how much will they increase the size of their balance sheet? I think that depends on the severity of the crisis. If we see something as bad as 2008, where these banks, major banks start to fail, and liquidity dries up and lending essentially stops throughout the economy, that's not something that the Federal Reserve wants. We need lending into the economy. We need businesses need lending to operate. Essentially, we have a debt-based economy here in the United States, and if lending dries up, if lending freezes, then the whole economy is not going to operate how it should. So the level of tightness, the level at which lending slows, will, in my opinion, be proportionate to the level of stimulus that the Federal Reserve provides. And this will, depending on how this affects unemployment, I think this will, in the short term, stimulate housing at least a little bit. I think we will see prices increase if we don't see mass unemployment. And even if we do see mass unemployment, inventory is so tight, there's so many buyers waiting on the sidelines, that once interest rates start to come down a little bit, I think we will see home prices go up at least a little bit. Maybe not as much as we saw in 2021 and 2022. Although if unemployment stays at the level that it's at now, and the Federal Reserve drops rates as drastically as we saw in 2021 and 2022, then we could see that level of price increase. But as long as the Federal Reserve doesn't cut rates that much, or if unemployment spikes significantly, then we'll see a mild increase in prices across the US economy. And then in the long term, as lending stabilizes, as quantitative tightening reverses, and the Fed starts to stimulate the economy a little bit more, we will see the housing market return to a more normal market moving into the future. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Thank you for watching. If you're leaving a comment, don't just say, no, you're wrong, I disagree with you. Write your opinion. Write why you think I'm wrong. I would love to have a conversation with you. Again, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.